Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help leaders build performance by understanding introversion. In this week's show, it's only banter. What does that mean? And is it an unacceptable trend? A discussion with Dr. Cliff P. Lewis. Cliff is a psychologist, coach, and HR professional with a speciality in leadership and diversity. We had a fascinating discussion about leadership, introversion, and how the pandemic might change things. Question of the week: spotting an introvert. The last of the answers to Andy's question, this time thinking about phone calls and emails. Just before speaking to Cliff, the news this week seems to have been full of environmental leadership, or perhaps lack of it. And the other thing I've noticed a lot has highlighted a phrase which, for me, has been a growing bad trend over the last few years. "It's only friendly banter" was a phrase I saw being used to defend comments in the Yorkshire cricket team. The club have been in so much hot water lately that one of their sponsors, Yorkshire Tea, has recently stopped sponsoring them. The idea of a tea company removing themselves from hot water made me smile, although the underlying issue of racism certainly didn't. Now, I'm not going to talk about the racism, but that phrase, "it's only banter." Is it only me who's heard it used more often in defence of unpleasant comments? Now, I get that within teams there will always, or perhaps should always, be internal jokes and perhaps gentle ribbing. That's part of what makes a good team. Now, introverts tend to be reflective, which could mean they think about and absorb that banter more. It doesn't mean that they are more sensitive. Being called the quiet ones, the shy ones, the ones who don't socialise, etc., could make them less tolerant than somebody with a thick skin. And of course, if you're often the subject of ongoing banter, whether introverted or not, you won't be as comfortable as you were within that team. And of course, all this is going on at a time when psychological safety is increasingly recognised as important within a team. Now, I don't know where the line between acceptable fun and less acceptable banter is, but if a team member is being suppressed, demoralised or hurt by it, your team has crossed the line. When it comes to stopping it, we are all leaders. We can all stand up or speak out against what could be psychologically painful for some people. Where's the line in your team, and who defends it? Let's move on and chat with Cliff. Welcome, Cliff.
Hello, John.
Off air, we were talking for a long time about leadership. Amazing number of insights that we both have that are similar around there. But before we dive into that, one simple question. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? And what difference does that make to you?
So that is actually a question that's quite interesting and that I've been asked before quite a few times, given my specific makeup, but also as a psychologist. So most people would say, oh, definitely an extrovert, because I'm loud and confident and funny and the class clown and all of these things. And I didn't even realize this myself. When I started my psychologist training, we get trained on various psychometric instruments. Many of them are personality assessments. And when you get trained on them, you typically do the assessment yourself. You get your own report and you use it as kind of a frame of reference when you do your training. And so the very first few all of them said the same thing. But when I started doing it, they came out saying that I am introverted, which I thought was very interesting, given just how I also saw myself through other people's eyes. And then I learned that all of my surface level extroversion that is observed by others, and myself also up to that point, is learned behavior. That is a long way of saying that I'm introverted with a lot of learned behavior that I've kind of picked up over the years to kind of cope in social settings as an introvert.
It's learned behaviour, and we all learn behaviours, as you say, to adapt ourselves, which is brilliant. But I think the other interesting piece there that I come across quite often is this idea that confident class clown doesn't have to be an extrovert, although it might be naturally what we assume them to be.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about leadership and introversion. Let's start with a really silly question. I cringe as I ask this one, Cliff, so I apologise. What makes a great leader? Are they introverted or extroverted?
Well, you say it's a silly question, but you will be surprised how often you hear this statement. Sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's a statement, and not even only in popular media or in the, I don't know, Harvard Business Review, even in academia. There's a lot of discussion around what does the personality profile of a good leader look like. I often find that's not a very productive or useful conversation to have because one, leadership is contextual and different contexts require different kinds of leadership. So you can't really make one statement saying this is the personality profile or, an extrovert or an introvert makes a good leader. It doesn't really help. The other thing is when you start assigning specific traits or elements of what you consider to be a good leader, you start getting very exclusionary. If you do it long enough, you end up saying white, middle class, cisgender, heterosexual men are good leaders. What I prefer doing is exploring.
Just for clarity, then, you're not saying heterosexual, etc., white middle class men are the best leaders?
No, I'm definitely not saying that, no. But the problem is that still to this day, the majority of leadership research has been done looking at case studies of white men because white men fill so many leadership roles. And so when that conversation about what makes the good leader happens, that's kind of where people end up. So what I prefer discussing is rather how do different leaders in different contexts create meaning? Because when you look at how people create meaning for others, that opens up a much more productive conversation, a conversation that is nuanced and sensitive to the context around good leadership. In some, none. Neither introverts or extroverts. Yeah.
So leadership then best looked at as a process of creating meaning, not about personality traits or skills or whatever. When we say creating meaning, what's the skinny on that?
Sense-making concept of sense-making and meaning creation is a fairly large body of knowledge on its own. But essentially it boils down to two things. One is you generate meaning or you derive meaning from actions that support what you want to achieve in your life and what's important for you. So put very simply, if I don't want to make a lot of money and I'm being asked to meet sales targets the whole time, I'm not going to find that process very meaningful because I don't really value making money. So it's about doing what is important or supporting a goal, whether that goal is explicit or subconscious. It's got to do with what do I want to achieve in life. The other part is community. It's a sense of community. If you are engaged in activities that support or build a sense of community and connection to others, that also creates meaning. So it's essentially doing things that's aligned with your goals and your values, and then community. Those are the two things that underpin meaning.
The point being that a good leader will help their team, the people in their business, understand their position in their business and give them some meaning, which makes their work more
so facilitate safe spaces to foster community within the organization, of course, and then also to align your people's values with yours. Obviously, that's a lot easier said than done, because if you're working with a big group of people, everyone's values aren't necessarily going to be exactly the same as the values of the organization or the values of the leader. So that is quite difficult, but yeah, that's essentially what good leadership, in my opinion, would entail.
Touching on something that I often see, where that many leaders don't necessarily understand introversion and what that might mean for introverted team members. What kind of behaviours destroy meaning, i.e. make us worse leaders?
I want to address the underpinning issue here when we talk about introversion and extroversion, and of course this is all in my own opinion, is typically when people talk about good leadership in the context of intra and extroversion, the assumption is typically that a good leader is extroverted. And that's because a lot of the leadership discourse is still underpinned by this idea of this heroic, romanticized leader, like this general of an army. Mm-hmm. And when you think of leadership in that way, you kind of end up eventually on extroversion. There's a lot of work, as I'm sure you are aware, that introverted leaders bring a lot of other valuable insights, behaviors, skills, things like maybe empathy, because they tend to talk a bit less, so they might be more inclined to listen to others. Although this is also a bit of a reductionist train of thought, because that doesn't mean extroverted leaders cannot be empathetic, but there's space for introverted people and extroverted people to be good leaders, to be effective leaders.
Totally agree with that one, Cliff. Absolutely. I'm just wondering, I see some people destroying meaning.
Oh, yes.
Not particularly good leaders because of the way they act.
Yes. So in that sense, I would make the recommendation, whether you are an extroverted leader or an introverted leader, to be self-aware of your own preferences, of your own behaviors, because I think both introverted and extroverted leaders can destroy meaning as much as they can create it, if they aren't aware of their impact on the context.
Yeah. Post-pandemic, things are changing. So working from home or not from home or hybrid, or perhaps just the context of everybody's understanding of work has changed. How does that affect creating meaning?
I mean, everyone talks about the future of work and the new world of work, but no one really knows what that means. What I can say, what it means in a broad sense, is we're dealing with a whole new set of rules. We're dealing with an entire new context, not just the way of doing things, the way of thinking about things. So if I take my own experience as an example, I've been advocating for remote work long before the pandemic hit. I couldn't understand how people could not see the benefits of that, and how we still have to go to the office, have a commute, all of these things, wear clothes that are uncomfortable. It just made no sense to me. And so post-pandemic, it looks like we're approaching post-pandemic, hopefully. People are now forced to think differently. And I can't say exactly, this is a toolkit, this is a list that you need to check off as a good leader within the new world of work. What I will say is, leaders, if they want to create meaning, if they want to make sure that they don't regress post-pandemic into old ways of doing things and resisting change, ask questions, make sure you understand how the new context affects your employees, because it won't be the same in all industries, all countries, all types of companies. Making sure that you understand how we think about work. What does work mean? What are the limitations? What are the expectations? And then how do we create meaning within that space?
Love it. Thank you. We're coming to the end, I'm afraid. So perhaps you can give us a quick tip for an introverted leader to improve their leadership ability.
Pretty much what I said earlier about self-awareness. If you are an introverted leader, be aware of your preferences, your behaviors, how your behaviors might be perceived, how those behaviors have an impact. Make a concerted effort to self-reflect on your position within a relational dynamic and what that impact is.
Many introverts I know are particularly good at self-reflection. That should be quite a good thing for them. And how about the other way around? How could an extrovert be a better leader?
I would make the same recommendation, although as you rightfully said, it might be a bit more difficult because extroverts, because they have different preferences, they have different ways of thinking, and it doesn't always go inwards. So self-awareness and reflecting on what impact you have on your context.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cliff. Finally, I'm sure that many of listeners will want to get back in touch with you. What's the best way for them to do that?
Oh, fabulous. Yes. So I'm available across all platforms at Cliff with one F, P Lewis. So Cliff, Plewis, and that's all socials. You can have a look at my website. It is LBVC. So that's La Bonne Vie, which is French for the good life. lbvc.co.za, because I'm in South Africa. And then also I have a whole bunch of other things like diversity journals on Amazon and all of these. I have my own podcast as well. And if you want to see all of these things, I have a Linktree page, and that Linktree is also Cliff with one F, P. Lewis.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Cliff. It's been brilliant to talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
What would you like to know about introversion in business? This week is the final part of my answer to Andy, who asked, how do you spot an introvert? It's a great question, as many have learned behaviours, as Cliff said in that discussion, which make them appear more extroverted. Introverts tend to think to talk, where extroverts tend to talk to think. Many introverts I've interviewed are more sensitive to interruptions when concentrating than extroverts are. And if those interruptions involve unexpected discussion without many non-verbal signals, that's called a phone call, it's likely that it won't be as welcome. If some of your team members clearly prefer email to phone, it could be another small signal to consider. Like any of these signals, on its own it doesn't mean a lot, other than look out for other signals whilst being aware of confirmation bias. What question would you like answered on the show? Whether you want to be on the show or just have your question answered like Andy, go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk where there's a box for you to ask your question. You could also follow on the Facebook page and discuss the answers at the show's page, which is Activate Your Introvert.
I'm John Baker. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. There's a new episode every Thursday at activateyourintrovert.co.uk and your favourite podcast provider. Till then, go be introversial, activating your introverts, building your business.